Wherever you turn around, it's a sea. It's endless, raging sea.
Christ against Satan, good against evil. We're about to discover the last deception of Earth's history.
But there is no way out.
The entire universe is involved.
Good evening and welcome to another presentation of What's Next, a final event symposium on final events. We trust that night after night you've been blessed, you've been enriched as we delve deep, scholarly deep, in the study of God's Word referencing last day events. It has really been inspirational, insightful to me personally, and I know that it has been a blessing. I've heard and received reports and testimonies of so many that are finding these presentations truly a blessing. We want to thank everyone that has participated, and it's my honor tonight to introduce to you not just another scholar, not just another professor, but a personal friend. Dr. Jorge Rico, born from Colombia, has served in ministry for over 32 years as pastor, ministerial secretary, teacher, and educational administrator. He has been a sought-out-after speaker both here and abroad to speak on a variety of subjects, primarily the sanctuary, final events, and also evangelism. We trust that tonight's message will be truly insightful to you. He will be covering a very important topic. We introduce this topic, or rather we are introduced to this theme in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, where we are told that there shall be a time of trouble such as there never was. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Rico and to hear what the servant of the Lord this evening has to share to each one of us. Be encouraged. Jesus is coming.
It is a good pleasure and a privilege to be able to address all my brothers and sisters in the Central California Conference and any other place that will be joining and watching this video. I've been asked to talk a little bit about a topic that has been a little bit confusing in the minds of some, maybe a little bit difficult to comprehend for some others, but nonetheless, it is a biblical topic. It's a topic that we all need to know about, especially as we are approaching not only the time of the end, but at the same time, we are approaching the second coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. And let me talk to you a little bit about the time of Jacob's trouble. Does that name sound a little difficult to you? Let me explain a little bit more what that is, and then we'll get into more details about it as we go in our topic. In order for us to understand, the scriptures do talk about a time that will be coming in which the church will be facing some difficult challenges. If we're going to talk about those challenges, they're being called time of trouble. However, if I were to define it, or you were to help me define it, let me just put it in a very simple, basic way. Time of trouble, it is a period of religious intolerance and persecution that God's church will be experiencing prior to the coming of the Lord. So that is in essence what the time of trouble is. Now, when we look at the time of trouble from the book of Revelation or from the scriptures, we will notice that the scriptures depict this period in two phases. And you're going to be watching on the screen as you see those faces there, but let me just explain them as you see them on the screen. The first one is what is called the previous time of trouble. That previous time of trouble takes place prior to the close of probation, when God's righteous people will experience an early end time test. And this will occur particularly after the proclamation of the three angels' messages and the enactment of the Sunday law. Okay, so that's what's called previous time of trouble. Now let's get into the next one, the second phase. That second phase is called Jacob's time of trouble. Now, what's the difference between the first one and the second one? Jacob's time of trouble happens after the close of probation, especially after the issuing of the decree that will now put the Christian church as an object, not only of persecution, but also of death. So it'll be a death decree against God's church. So once again, when we're looking at a distinction between those two, the time of trouble, we can call it previous time of trouble. We can call it also Jacob's time of trouble. The distinction between those two will be, one will be taking place prior to the close of probation, and the second one will be taking place after the close of probation, when heaven will then close that time of judgment, and now whoever will be accepted when will be sealed, and those who will not will then eventually receive the mark of the beast. Now, you may be wondering in your mind, does the Bible really talk about that? Well, before we go into the New Testament, what I like to do, I like to give you a little background to it, so you can see that this is not something made up by New Testament authors, or maybe made up by some speakers, but this is a concept that has deep historical or biblical foundations. So let me take you first to the Old Testament, okay? And let's look at the Old Testament as a foundation that can move us into understanding the New Testament. In ancient times, God's people also experienced a time of trouble. Not only did it happen at an individual level, but it also happened at a national level. So you can see that this topic or this experience not only is individual, but it's also national. Okay. Now let's look at a couple of examples. Okay. I mean, there are several examples, but we're just going to be looking at some. The first one, we'll find that in Genesis chapter 32, verses 6 through 12. Okay. I'm not going to be reading the entire text, okay? But I'm going to be relating to you the story. This is the time when Jacob is coming back from Padam Aram, the place where Laban, his uncle, was keeping him busy watching after his cattle and all his animals. And then that's where he met Leah and he met Rachel. And now he has his family expanded. And then he decided to return back to Canaan. So he's coming back. And in Genesis 32, we begin reading that Jacob saw angels. And then after he saw those angels, he decided he needed to make some crucial fixings with his brother. So he decided to send some gifts to his brothers, some messages. He knew he was coming back home, but his brother was still upset about what he did to him, and he wanted to avoid any confrontation. So he wanted to mend his mistake. So he sent some messengers, some gifts, and the return of the messengers was, yeah, we gave him the message, we delivered the message, but he's coming to meet you with a group of individuals well armed. So now Jacob gets worried. Okay. But now look at the text carefully, because his concern is not so much about his life, but now his concern is about now his spiritual condition and also the condition of his families and all his servants. And so he begins spreading and moving things in a different way until you come to a time when Jacob goes by himself. And the scripture there in Genesis 32 will tell us that being alone, Jacob met an individual. And in Genesis 32, you will find beginning in verse 24, that Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. And then he realized that this man was not just a regular individual, because when he saw that he did not prevail against them, now this man touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. Now, who could be that would be just touching Jacob's hip and it would go out of joint, out of place? At that moment, Jacob realized he was not just wrestling with someone, he was wrestling with some special type of individual. And so this man told Jacob, "Let me go, for the day breaks." And Jacob responded, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Right there, you can infer already that Jacob knew that this was not a regular human being, that this was a spiritual individual, someone who was coming from up high, because now he's asking for a special blessing. And the blessing consisted in a change of name. Why was Jacob wrestling? Jacob was wrestling because he was not successful at getting his brother to understand that he was apologizing, that he was sorry for what he did. He was concerned about the results of his brothers approaching him. And so he was going through a time of trouble. That brought about anguish. And that anguish was intensified when he got to wrestle with this man. Hosea tells us that this man was an angel. And that was understood by Jacob. And this is why Jacob asked, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And the blessing consisted in a change of name from being Jacob, Yaakov, in the Hebrew language, to Israel, or Yisrael in the Hebrew language. You will notice now that that change of name had something to do with what's going on in Jacob's mind. From being a supplanter or a deceiver, which is along the lines of the meaning of the name Jacob, to now moving into Israel. And the name Israel means wrestle, El means God. So it's someone who is wrestling with God. But now notice, he's not wrestling with God because he's opposing God or he's moving against God, but he's wrestling with God because he's wrestling alongside with God. God is being his support. God is fighting with him. And so then we see an example of that type of trouble in the Old Testament. Here's another example. You can find it in Psalms 22, that's one of those passages, the case of David. When David is being persecuted by King Saul, he went through a very difficult time of trouble. So much that in Psalms 22, now his anguish and his trouble that he describes there is used later as a description of the time of trouble that Jesus went through, even at the cross. Then you look at 1 Kings chapter 17, the story of Elijah, when he was asked by God to go and present himself before the king. And he told the king that there will be no rain except for his word. And then Elijah left the court. And then after that, the king was looking for Elijah. And obviously, Elijah found a hiding place where God directed him to go. And it was okay up to that point until then Elijah had to face Jezebel, King Ahab's consort. And now she issued a death decree against Elijah. And Elijah then experienced a time of trouble such that he decided just to run away. And he even asked God to kill him, to take his life. And you can read that in 1 Kings chapter 19. So in all these cases, you're going to find that a time of trouble was followed then by God telling the individuals, I'm still with you. I'm fighting alongside with you. He did it to Jacob. In the case of David, he also made promises to David. And in the case of Elijah, God even approached him and told him, what are you doing here? And then God says, it is not by army, by might, human strength, but it is by my spirit that you will then overcome. So in all those times, in all those examples that you find in Old Testament foundations, you will notice that a time of trouble takes place, but that is followed after a divine promise of protection and of blessings. Now, having this in mind, let's move into the New Testament. We have an Old Testament foundation, and New Testament writers will not do anything without that Old Testament foundation. That's crucial. Now, let's understand this time of trouble from the New Testament perspective, okay? And especially, let's go to the book of Revelation, and let's look at the book of Revelation. So let me invite you to turn your Bibles with me to the book of Revelation, and there in chapter 12 of Revelation, and we'll be focusing specifically in verse 17. Chapter 12, verse 17. And as you see the text on the screen, let's read it together. It's an important text, okay? It's an important text that I want you to keep in mind, okay? Because it is crucial for us to understand this whole idea of time of trouble. Why is it going to come? What's going to happen? In a very nutshell, very succinct way, John is going to present it to us in chapter 12, and then he's going to amplify it a little later, okay? So now let's look at the text, okay? Let's read it from the scriptures. This is what I'll be doing. I'll be using my new King James Version, okay, for the regular reading. However, there will be times when I'm going to be translating literally from the Greek text, okay? So, because there will be few things that unfortunately in the translation, they're not really visible. They're not really, that we can really see it. So I'm going to bring those out to you, all right? So let's look at Revelation chapter 12, verse 17. In verse 17, John says the following, okay? And the dragon was enraged with the woman or over the woman, okay? And went to make war with the rest of her seed. Now, I know the New King James Version and some other translations will use offspring or will use remnant or some other words. I like to emphasize that the text says not offspring, not remnant. It says the rest of her seed, because that term seed connects us back to the very beginning. It takes us back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Okay, it is the seed of the woman that was going to be facing the dragon, the enemy, throughout history, even into the time of the end. Now, this woman and the seed of the woman will now be distinguishing themselves. And Revelation 12, verse 17 will help us see that distinction, that difference. Okay, let me finish reading verse 17. And again, I'm reading and I'm translating literally. Okay, so when to make word with the rest of her seed, the ones keeping the commitments of God and having the testimony of Jesus. Now, you might have noticed that a little different from your rendering. Okay, why? Because normally you will see it translated the one keeping the commitment. Who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony. That's the actual translation that we have. Actually, when we read it in the original, we're going to notice that it's not just who have or who keep, but the way John presents it, he uses the verb in the participle, which then turns the translation or makes the translation a little bit more special. Why? Because when you say who keep the commandments, it's like you keep it once or you keep it twice. There is not necessarily an ongoing activity. And when you have the testimony, it's like you have it once, you have it twice. But when you read, as John presented it, the ones who are keeping or the ones who are having, then you know that this is an ongoing activity. The observance of God's commitments is not a one time, or it's not like something that you can do only for some time, but it's got to be an ongoing, all the time. So this seed of the woman is one who is continually keeping God's commandments and is continually having the testimony of Jesus. Why is this significant? I'll tell you why it is significant. Because the observance of the commitments of God and having the testimony of Jesus is the characteristic that distinguishes God's people throughout history. If you go back to the Old Testament, your foundational passage, then you're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 8, verse 20. And in chapter 8, verse 20, now the prophet says that those who are going to be following the Lord, then to the law and to the testimony. If they don't speak accordingly, they have no light. So Isaiah is letting us know God's people have the two same elements, God's law and also the testimony. So that distinguishes God's people in Old Testament times. That's going to distinguish God's people in the New Testament. So that is indicating to us that mark doesn't change. Doesn't change. And even to the end of time, that doesn't change. So once we find that, this text then will help us see another element. And that is in Revelation 12:17, God's people will experience the wrath of Satan. But now for the first time in Revelation 12, the Lord is showing John that the church will not be united in the time of the end, that the church will be divided into two main camps or two main groups. And you may be wondering, wait a minute, but don't we talk about the idea of all churches uniting, sometimes called ecumenism? And isn't that the hope and desire of many people out there, that the church eventually will be united into one single idea and in one single group? And John is saying, no, the church will be divided. But how is this division taking place? Because as it is right now, Christianity is already subdivided. We have at least four main different groups. One, you're looking at Roman Catholicism. And that was the only Christian church up until the High Middle Ages, 1500s. And with the 1500s, now we have the development of the Protestant Reformation. After that, now we no longer have one unified church. We have now two groups of churches. We have Roman Catholicism and Protestant or Protestantism. But that didn't stop right there. Because then, towards the middle or the end of the 1800s, now we have in Protestantism a subdivision. And then from Protestantism, we have a branching out of evangelicalism or the evangelical movement. And this is what we've been having up until the mid 1900s. Three different movements within Christianity. And then after the middle of the 1900s, we have another development. And this is now a development that is being called non-denominational congregations. So these are churches and pastors who establish their own church. Many a time they are mega churches, but they have no religious affiliation with any large or larger Protestant denomination or group. So now currently the church is subdivided into four main groups: Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, Evangelicalism, and non-denominationals. Okay? But then we are all also talking or hearing about people saying, let's unite. Let's forget about differences and let's be united. And John is telling me in Revelation 12:17, this is not going to happen. Because the church will be divided in the end. And it's going to be divided into two main groups. And those two main groups are clearly distinguished in verse 17. One group is called the woman, and the other group is called the seed of the woman. Now, you may be wondering, wait a minute. Isn't this the same woman that is presented at the beginning of chapter 12 as a beautiful woman that is persecuted by the devil, that it experiences a difficult moment throughout the Middle Ages? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. But notice one thing. That very same woman that experienced persecution earlier in chapter 12 of Revelation now experiences some sort of a change, that this woman now is no longer a threat to the devil. He's still mad at her, according to verse 17. He's enraged against the woman. But notice that he does no longer persecute the woman as he did earlier. Now, his target is the seed of the woman. And you may be wondering, why? What happened? The woman is seen one more time in the book of Revelation. And I'm going to give you the reference. And that reference is found in Revelation 17. But this time, the woman is not presented as a beautiful woman that is dressed with the sun, has a crown of 12 stars, and then the moon under her feet, like you saw in John 12. Now in John 17, this very same woman, and I'm saying this very same woman, is now presented as a great harlot. Something happened, that a change was brought about. And you may be wondering, wait a minute, no, this can't be. Now, so you can see that there is a distinction. Notice that in Revelation 17, this woman called great harlot is not alone. She is riding over the beast. And if you understand with me that the beast represents papal system, then you know that the woman is not the papal system, it is the beast that she's riding on. So obviously, this woman has to be another religious system. Are you following so far? So now you can see that there is a distinction that John is clearly presenting to us. This woman was okay until something happens that brought about a change, and this woman will be different. What makes her different? You're going to be looking at the second group in Revelation 17, and the second group talks about the seed of the woman. But this seed of the woman has a couple of features that distinguished the seed from the woman. One feature is that it keeps the law of God. And remember, John uses the verb in participle. Is keeping continually, ongoing activity, the law of God. And that includes the Sabbath. And secondly, it has is continually having the testimony of Jesus. Now, why are these two separate? Simply because the time of trouble involves God's law. God's law is at stake in the time of trouble. And the devil's opposition will not be against those who do not have the law of God, but it's going to be against those who do have or observe the law of God. And that's what brings then that time of trouble. So what Revelation 12:17 then is doing is disclosing the deceptive nature of a woman who will join forces against God's people who are observing God's commandments and who also are having the testimony of Jesus. That's what makes the distinction. Now, having this, John will take you then into chapter 13. And in chapter 13, now John is going to present this time of trouble in a more amplified way so that chapter 12, verse 17 will make more sense to our understanding. So let me invite you to go with me to chapter 13. And in chapter 13, we have now a chapter that is subdivided into two main segments. The first segment of it is from verses 1 all the way to verse 10, okay? And it presents the activities of the beast. Those activities describe now the persecution that the church experienced throughout the Middle Ages, the same one that the woman experienced in chapter 12, verses 13 all the way to 16. But then God preserved it. And now the second section of Revelation 13 begins in verses 11 and 18. And there, now John is taking the attention of his readers more into the future, more into the time of the end. And it is at that time when the enemy, which is called dragon in Revelation 12, which John himself provides the identification of this dragon in verse 9. This dragon is the devil, it is Satan, the ancient serpent, and the deceiver. Okay. This will now raise two powers in the time of the end. One will be bringing back again the sea beast of the first segment, or the first portion of Revelation 13. It's going to come back again, okay? But now he's going to raise a second power, which is called the land beast. Some others will call it lamb-like beast. I like to call it land beast only so that we can see the contrast between the sea beast and the land beast. Okay? And these two powers are the ones who will now bring about the time of trouble on God's people, because they're going to be forcing God's people to break God's law. Now, how is that going to happen? Remember, chapter 13 will amplify chapter 12. Okay? And the discussion of chapter 12, verse 17 will now be also amplified in the second half, beginning in verse 11, all the way to the end of chapter 13. Now, how are they going to do that? In chapter 13, verses 12 and 15, you're going to read that these two powers, the sea beast and the land beast, otherwise called also image of the beast, will want to be worshipped. You can read that in chapter 13, verses 12 and 15. They want to be worshipped. And you know that according to God's commandments, the only one who is to be worshipped is God. So there is one breaking of God's principle. But in addition to that, in chapter 13, verses 16 and 17, these two powers will want to enforce the mark of the beast. And you will be wondering, what does the mark of the beast have to do with God's law? Very simple, my friend. Brother who is listening to me and is watching this presentation through the comfort of your homes and your screens there, the mark of the beast is placed in opposition to the seal of God. And you know that both are mentioned in the book of Revelation. The seal of God is presented in chapter 7 of Revelation, and the mark of the beast is presented in chapter 13. While John or the scriptures do not tell you exactly what the mark of the beast is, the Bible tells you what the seal of God is. And when you go back to the Old Testament, you're going to find in places like Exodus chapter 31, verses 13 all the way to 17, where God is telling Moses, and I give them my Sabbath, that it will be a distinction, and that you will know that I am the Lord your God who sanctifies you. It will distinguish you from all the other nations. You will read also in Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 12 and 20, where once again quoting from Exodus 31, the prophet says that God gave them the Sabbath as a sign that he is the one who sanctifies them. It was a distinguishing feature for God's people. And so now John, using the same imagery, comes back into Revelation and tells us that seal of God is placed in God's people when they follow God's principles. Let me abound a little bit more on this so you can get the whole Old Testament background, because you will find some individuals saying that this seal of God in Revelation 13 is not the same as the Sabbath, only because the word seal or mark does not really appear in other passages. But let me tell you the context so you can have a better idea. In Revelation 7, when the seal of God is mentioned for the first time in the Apocalypse, it is in the context of persecution, difficult times, and God is saying, do not release the winds to blow on the earth until I seal my servants in their foreheads. Now, where is that concept coming from? Sealing on the foreheads, or marking on the foreheads, or however you want to call it. You go back to Ezekiel, especially chapter 9, 8 and 9, when in vision Ezekiel has seen God's throne coming down to Jerusalem. God has taken the prophet from chamber to chamber within the temple, showing Ezekiel all the abominations that the leaders of Israel were doing. And after each one, Ezekiel was getting more and more surprised. And God is saying, don't get too surprised. You haven't really finished watching everything that is going on. Until he showed them how the leaders of Israel are turning their backs on God and then bowing down before the Son. And then he shows to Ezekiel how there will be an individual who has a seal with him, who will be accompanied with other two, and will come to Jerusalem and will be placing a seal on all those who are crying out for the sins of Jerusalem. And that seal will be placed on the forehead. And after the seal is placed on the forehead, then God would allow destruction to come to Jerusalem. Same type of language that we're finding in Revelation 7. Same type of language. So now, that seal of God is placed, and once that is done on the forehead, then God will allow the challenges and the time of trouble to come. And then Ezekiel says that Sabbath was that seal that was placed on the forehead of the people back in Jerusalem. So when we look at the same terminology in Revelation, we can safely conclude then that seal that represented the Sabbath in Ezekiel's time is also representing the Sabbath in our end time. Because now either people will have to decide between following God's principle despite of what will be coming, or accepting the mark of the beast, playing the safe, even though knowing that that's going to be the end for them. So the time of trouble will only be possible, and people will receive the support of the authorities and masses due to the beast's ability to deceive the world. Revelation 13, verses 13 through 15. And Jesus spoke of this deception in his prophetic sermon there in Matthew 24, when he says, hey, I have told you now so that when it happens, it will not take you by surprise. And he says it several times so that you will not be deceived. Chapter 24 of Matthew, verses 4, 11, 21 and 22, 24 and 25, verse 29. Several times, Jesus brings about this deceptive activity that will be taking place prior to the second coming. Now, this time of trouble will be prompted by the proclamation of the three angels' messages that are presented in Revelation 14. This proclamation will be worldwide. It will involve the nature of the gospel, and at the same time will accomplish few things. One, if you read verse 6, it will tell us that this everlasting gospel is not only something that is proclaimed in the present or future, but it's a message that has been proclaimed from the very beginning. This is why it's called everlasting, because it comes from the beginning. It's not everlasting in the sense of the future, but it's everlasting in the sense that it also takes us back to the very beginning. So God's message of salvation has always been the same. Salvation is only by faith in the blood of the Lamb, not by works. However, many will talk to you about salvation or the process of salvation being divided into two. Like salvation in the Old Testament was only by works, laws, and salvation in the New Testament by faith and grace. When in reality, salvation has been all along one and the same, by faith in the blood of the Lamb that takes away the sin of the world. It is that message that needs to be proclaimed. And it will be proclaimed in three different messages. The first one, verse 7, Revelation 14, verse 7. The angel invites the world to worship God, fear God, give him glory, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him. Invites the world to worship God in the language of the Sabbath. In the time of the end, God's law will be upheld, but more specifically, the fourth commandment, the Sabbath commitment, will be upheld because the angel uses a language that is brought from the Old Testament. He says, worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the seas, and all the fountains of waters. That's what the angel says in Revelation 14:7. You take that message, you take that wording, that phrase, you go back to the Old Testament, you will find it in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. Why should we observe the Sabbath today? Because the Lord God in 7 days made the heavens and the earth and the seas and everything that is in them. So it's an invitation to the whole world not to forsake God's law, not to forsake his Sabbath. It's still to be taken serious. And if you want to know now that more clearly the distinction between the woman and the seed of the woman, while the seed of the woman keeps the law of God and has the testimony of Jesus, the woman doesn't do that. And that's what makes the distinction between the two. And this is why the persecution is not against the woman, but the persecution will only be against those who observe God's law and have the testimony of Jesus. And that's going to be proclaimed. Here's the second message. It will disclose Babylon's deception. Babylon will be exposed. People will have an opportunity to choose between truth and error. And then, third message. God will reveal the true nature of Satan's two earthly powers. Sea beast and land beast. They are now exposed. Their religious systems, according to the description in Revelation 13, the systems that do not represent God or his principles. They claim the name of God, but represent their own principles, their own ideas. So in this time of trouble, Satan's wrath will know no limits and will begin persecution against the seed of the woman. But you and I do not need to worry about that. For some people, this may sound scary. They may not even want to hear about it. They may even get confused about it. But let me tell you something. Knowing about this time, it's only because we have a loving God. We have a merciful God. And we have a gracious God. He knows that this is coming. And he's not hiding it from us. Because he wants us to prepare ourselves for that time. Let me illustrate it this way. Some years back, and I'm going back again to the 1980s, a phenomenon took place in Colombia that changed the life of many individuals and even in the country itself. For some time, there was this place that is called in Colombia Nevado del Ruiz. It is a mountain that has a lot of snow, and resorts were built there for people who wanted to go and ski, have time, good time. But for some time, there was some trembling, some shaking in that place. At first, people were okay, but as the shaking continued augmenting, people got a little concerned. So they called on the authorities, and the authorities came, made some check. They didn't find anything, at least at that moment. And so they told the people, no worries, that's okay. Everything will be fine. And the shaking continued. And it was getting a little worse and worse. It was increasing the level. And people were calling back and getting the authorities. The authorities were saying, no, we're good. It's okay. No problem. It's safe. Until one evening, close to Christmas Day, people went to sleep, and there was this little town that was at the foothills of this Nevado del Ruiz, of this mountain. People went to sleep as normal without realizing that that would be their very last night on planet Earth. That night, in the middle of the night, then the volcano erupted. Lava mixed with snow came sliding down from the mountain. And so it turned into a heavy mud that was like burning. And it just came down to the town that was called Armero back in those days. And it just blanketed the whole town. It covered the whole town, and it buried the people there in the town. Very few people survived, especially those who just did not spend the night in that town because they were traveling, doing some other businesses somewhere else. But most of the town was basically buried. The town disappeared. Nowadays, that is considered a national cemetery. And if the authorities would have only made an effort to warn the people that the volcano was erupting, that was going to be coming, people would have made plans, or at least would have an opportunity to make some plans to go somewhere else, find refuge or something. But the authorities told the people, no, everything is okay, no problem, you're safe. And that fatal night came, and the town was buried under lava mixed with snow. And most resident or inhabitant of this town perished, and the town disappeared. God is not this way. He knows that this period is coming. It will come. This is something that, if it is in the scriptures, you cannot make mistake about it. My dear friend, brother, sister who is listening to me at this moment, please don't freak out. Don't be totally confused or scared. The time is going to come, and there is no way we're going to avoid it. But here's the blessing. Our loving God, our gracious God, has decided to reveal it to us in the scriptures, so that we not only understand and know what's coming up, but at the same time, we can work and prepare ourselves accordingly. What is God's promise to us? Let me read it to you. Let me read at least one promise. There are too many promises in the scriptures, but let me read at least one. Let me invite you to the book of Psalms. Psalm 91. And I'm sure you know this psalm, or you recognize it at least. Psalm 91 has a beautiful message. Beginning in verse 1. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him I will trust. Surely He shall deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the perilous pestilence. He shall cover you with his feathers, and under His wings you shall take refuge. His truth shall be your shield and buckler. What a promise. Why He's doing that? Why? Notice verse 9. Because you have made the Lord, who is my refuge, even the Most High, your dwelling place. No evil shall befall you, nor shall any plague come near your dwelling. What a promise. Let me conclude with the following remark. We have nothing to worry about what the future will bring, unless we forget how the Lord has worked in the past. Recognize that statement? I think it's a biblical promise. Actually, a divine promise. It's for you and it is for me. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord help you prepare yourself for this upcoming time. And by God's grace, may the Lord also take us home to spend eternity with Him. God bless you.